Did you ever get blamed for something you didn't do, just because you were easy to blame?
We didn't think you'd mind sitting this one out, my mom said, almost casually, like she was offering me the last slice of pizza she knew I didn't want, or pretending to be surprised that I wasn't invited to a high school sleepover that she herself had organized. Her voice had that syrupy tone she used when she knew she'd crossed a line, but couldn't be bothered to apologize for it, let alone admit it. You're always so busy with work. We figured you'd appreciate the quiet. Quiet. I nodded, maybe even smiled a little, because when you've trained yourself for over 30 years to swallow the sting before it hits your face, your body starts doing the work before your brain has even caught up. But inside, something buckled. Something ancient and long ignored. Not rage. Not sadness. Something colder. Heavier. Resigned, maybe. And dangerously clear. See, I've always been the one who picks up the check. Not because I'm rich, but because somewhere along the way, I learned that if I didn't pay, I wouldn't be invited. Or worse, I'd be blamed for ruining the moment. The first time I helped out, I was 23 and barely making it through my job as an assistant at a marketing firm downtown, juggling spreadsheets by day and bartending at night just to cover rent. My dad called and said the roof was leaking. I wired him $1,500. No questions. No hesitation. And no thank you. It never stopped after that. From Sophie's dental surgery in grad school to the condo deposit for my parents' retirement dream house in Naples, Florida, the numbers got bigger, the texts got shorter, and the gratitude disappeared entirely. I was the successful one, the one who could spare a little, even though most of what I was sparing came from sacrifice. I skipped vacations. I ignored my own student loans for years. I chose a job I hated because it paid better. And all the while, I kept hearing that same damn sentence on repeat like a family mantra. It's just what family does. Sophie, my younger sister by 5 years, was always the golden child. And I don't mean that metaphorically. My mom actually referred to her that way. My little golden girl. It started when she was a kid, prettier, softer, more agreeable. She cried at the right moments. She smiled on cue. I was the one who asked questions, who got labeled difficult, who didn't want to wear matching dresses at church. By the time we were adults, the dynamic hadn't shifted. If anything, it calcified. 2 nights before they left for Maui, I got a strange ping on my phone, a notification from a shared Apple calendar my dad had accidentally invited me to months ago and never removed me from. Flight to OGG, it read. I didn't think much of it until I saw the name of the passengers. Greg Meyer. Linda Meyer. Sophie Meyer. No Rachel. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to, not out of shock, not anymore, but out of habit. It was like watching a movie you've already seen a dozen times, hoping this time maybe the ending would change. But it never did. Not with them. They didn't just forget me. They never really included me in the first place. I wasn't part of the story. I was the sponsor. I didn't say anything when my mom called the next morning to check in. Her voice was full of cheer, that overly bright tone reserved for retail employees and people you want something from. She mentioned they'd be flying first class, that they were treating themselves to some overdue relaxation. Sophie's been so stressed lately with everything, she added, not even bothering to elaborate. I didn't ask what everything was, because I already knew. It was probably some man who didn't text her back, or a job she quit without notice because it wasn't aligned with her values. And then, like she was tossing me a scrap from the table, she said the line I'd never forget. We didn't think you'd mind sitting this one out. I said nothing, just breathed. And I think she took that as agreement. Maybe it was. But not the kind she thought. Later that night, something nudged me to look at my financial dashboard. I hadn't in a while, too busy with work, deadlines, the usual burnout cocktail of responsibilities I never dared speak aloud. When the numbers loaded, my eyes didn't go straight to the balance. Instead, they went to the auto transfers. Greg Meyer, monthly allowance. Linda Meyer, Visa card. Sophie, Zelle recurring. It was all there, in black and white, my generosity turned into a direct deposit schedule. My family living a lifestyle paid for by someone they couldn't be bothered to invite. That was the moment it all crystallized. I wasn't family to them. I was a damn subscription service. One they never thanked, never acknowledged, and worst of all, one they believed would never end. But I had news for them. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even heartbroken. I was done. And that kind of clarity? That's dangerous. The next morning, I opened my laptop. One by one, I deactivated the cards. The Amex in my father's name, gone. The joint account that my mom used to Venmo Sophie for emergencies shut down. I paused when I got to Sophie's phone bill. Part of me wanted to leave it running just so I could see the text meltdown. But no, she could figure out how to pay her own damn way for once. Then I sat back and watched the dots on the map move toward Maui. Let them enjoy the flight. Let them clink champagne glasses and pose for selfies. Let them think I was busy with work or too cold to care. They had no idea that by the time they landed, the rug would be gone from under their feet. And the silence on my end? That was no oversight. It was a warning. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over you not when you're sad or hurt or even angry, but when you finally recognize a pattern that's been playing out in the background of your entire life, a silent rhythm of being overlooked, used, dismissed. And the truth of it becomes so undeniably clear that there's no room left for doubt, no space left for excuses, and no more capacity to lie to yourself about what kind of role you've really played in your own family story. That quiet settled over me 2 days after I cut the financial umbilical cord that had tethered me to my parents and to Sophie for the better part of 2 decades. It wasn't a moment filled with triumph or satisfaction. There was no dramatic music swelling in the background, no cinematic moment of empowerment. It was just me, sitting alone in my apartment, cross-legged on the kitchen floor, sipping reheated coffee from a chipped mug, realizing that, for the first time in years, nobody needed anything from me. And the only reason for that was because I had finally chosen to stop giving. They were in the air by then, somewhere between Denver and Honolulu, wrapped in a cloud of entitlement and blissful ignorance, most likely sipping white wine and ordering extra snacks without a thought in the world about who had made that luxury possible. I imagined my mother leaning into my father's shoulder, flipping through one of those airline magazines filled with overpriced resort wear and monogrammed beach bags, making passive-aggressive comments about the ridiculousness of Rachel's constant work obsession, while my father probably nodded in agreement, distracted by some golf article he'd already read 3 times. And Sophie, well, she was likely updating her Instagram story with window seat selfies, sunlit and curated, writing captions like, "Finally taking time for me," as if she hadn't been taking time for herself her entire life, always on someone else's dime. But this time, they didn't know the dime was gone. This time, the invisible benefactor had stepped out of frame. I knew exactly how this would play out. I had made sure of it. The hotel was 5-star, perched above a private beach with butlers and signature cocktails served in pineapples, the kind of place that pre-authorized every charge well in advance. My parents had used the family credit card, one that traced directly back to an account under my name, the same card they used for groceries, flights, dry cleaning, and birthday gifts for cousins I barely remembered. I hadn't just shut down the card. I'd called the bank and flagged the charges, citing unauthorized use. There was a sense of finality in hearing the customer service rep confirm the cancellation, her voice professional and disinterested, as if she were reading lines from a script. It felt surgical, precise. No mess. No confrontation. Just a quiet turning off of the tap. What I hadn't expected, or maybe hadn't prepared myself for, was the guilt that started to creep in during the following day. It wasn't a loud, obvious guilt. It was subtle. The kind of guilt that slips in under the door like a draft, tugging at your logic and whispering familiar voices from childhood. Family forgives, don't make a scene, be the bigger person. I thought about calling. Not to undo anything, but just to explain. To give them a chance to understand why. To let them know it wasn't some impulsive tantrum or act of cruelty. It was the result of years of quiet disappointments stacked on top of one another until they became something unmanageable. But then I remembered the look on my mother's face when she'd said it. "We didn't think you'd mind," like it was a kindness, like I should be grateful not to be invited, not to be burdened with their presence. No. Let them sit in it. The first message came 3 hours after their plane touched down. A voicemail from my dad, confused and irritated, his voice low and tight with discomfort. Hey, Ratch, just landed. Having a bit of an issue with the card. Not sure what's going on. Maybe a bank thing? Call when you get this. No, thank you for the trip. No, wish you were here. Just immediate entitlement wrapped in forced politeness. Then came a text from Sophie, all caps. Why has the card declined? We're standing at the front desk. It made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly the kind of self-centered panic I had expected. No question about what happened, no curiosity about whether I was okay, just the immediate assumption that I had somehow wronged them by simply removing access to my money. An hour later, another message, this time from my mom, slightly more desperate, attempting charm but failing. Sweetheart, there's something weird going on with the card. The hotel says it's not working. We're sure it's just a misunderstanding, but we're a little stranded here. Could you please give us a call when you're free? Stranded. As if their entire world had shifted in a matter of hours. As if they weren't the ones who had deliberately excluded me. As if they hadn't plotted and planned a full week in paradise, while never once considering how it might feel to leave behind the very person who made it possible. But I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't respond. I turned off read receipts. I muted their numbers. Not out of spite. Not out of malice. But because I was finally, fully awake to what my silence meant, not as an absence, but as a statement. Let them stew. Let them feel, for once, the cold edge of not being prioritized. Let them learn what it feels like when the person you depend on decides to stop carrying you. Because sometimes, the cruelest thing you can do to people who've taken you for granted isn't to scream or cry or demand an apology. It's to simply walk away and let the sound of nothing be the loudest consequence they've ever heard. They say revenge is best served cold, but no one ever talks about the eerie silence that comes with it, the kind of silence that settles in your bones and wraps around your chest like a second skin, not tight enough to suffocate you, but just enough to remind you with every breath that something irreversible has been set in motion. By the time their plane touched down in Maui, and their sandals hit that glossy tile floor at Kahului Airport, that silence had already taken on a shape, a weight, a quiet force of its own, and although I wasn't there to see their faces, I could practically hear the confusion, the sharp whispering between them, the soft panic blooming under their carefully maintained vacation smiles as they realized something was very, very wrong. In the beginning, I imagined they didn't react too strongly, maybe a shrug from my dad, a casual, try it again, to the hotel clerk, a raised eyebrow from my mom. That awkward smile she wears whenever she's trying to smooth things over without revealing the anxiety building behind her eyes. Maybe even a snide comment from Sophie about technology being so unreliable. But then came the moment when the second card didn't go through, and then the third, and that was when I knew the illusion had started to crack, not all at once, but in that slow, splintering way that always starts with confusion and ends with the weight of reality pressing down on every self-important assumption they'd carried onto that plane. What they didn't know, what they could never have anticipated, was that I hadn't just cut them off in the technical sense, I had erased their ability to function inside the life they'd come to expect, the one they'd built entirely on the back of my success, my exhaustion, and my emotional availability. The hotel room had been booked with the family credit account, which, although they had long assumed was theirs, was still legally tied to me. The restaurant reservations, the car rental, the tour packages Sophie had gleefully clicked on without so much as checking a balance, all of it traced back to me. I hadn't just pulled the rug out from under them. I'd taken the whole damn floor with it. Back at home, I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open but untouched, a mug of coffee going cold in my hands as I listened to the first voicemail for the third time, not because I needed to hear it again, but because there was something so surreal, so darkly satisfying, about hearing my father's voice falter for the first time in years. He sounded like a man who'd been slapped mid-sentence. He didn't yell. He didn't rage. He just sounded confused. And that confusion was almost worse than anger. Because in that confusion was the core truth he'd never had to face before, that maybe, just maybe, I was no longer afraid of disappointing them. They called again. And again. My mom left a voicemail that was almost too sweet, her voice honey-thick with apology, or at least with the performance of one. "Rachel, sweetheart, we're not sure what's going on," she said, in a tone that would have sounded warm if I hadn't spent a lifetime learning the difference between concern and manipulation. "We're at the front desk, and there's been some confusion with the credit card. Maybe there was a fraud alert? These banks can be so jumpy. Just give us a call when you get a chance, okay? Love you. Love you." The words hung in the air like an afterthought, a last-ditch effort to cast a safety net over a situation that was spiraling out of control. They weren't panicking yet. Not fully. Not visibly. But I knew the panic was coming. Not because they had lost access to funds. That they could fix eventually. But because for the first time in years, they would be forced to confront the fact that the person they had excluded, dismissed, and casually betrayed was also the one who had quietly kept the entire engine running. I didn't respond. I didn't explain. I let them sit in the unknown. I let their questions grow teeth. I let the discomfort thicken around them like smoke. And while they spiraled, while they scrambled to reach me, to figure out what had gone wrong, I began to remember every small moment that had led to this, the years of being left out, of being told I was too serious, too much, too ambitious. The holidays where I was expected to pay for dinner, but never asked to carve the turkey. The birthdays where I footed the bill, but somehow still ended up alone at the end of the night. The slow, relentless erosion of love disguised as expectation. Later that night, I opened the group chat, not the one they had left me out of, but the original family thread, the one we had used back when things were still salvageable, back when I still believed I could earn their respect if I just kept giving. I typed nothing, just opened it and stared, as if the words I needed would magically appear from the silence they had left behind. Instead, a message appeared. "Sophie." "Of course." "Rachel, seriously? Are you doing this on purpose? We're stranded. This isn't funny. We have no access to anything right now. What the hell is going on? Call me." There it was, not worry, not humility, not an ounce of curiosity about why this was happening. Just anger. Entitlement. As if I were an employee failing at my job. I didn't answer her either. Instead, I closed my laptop, stood up, and walked to the window, staring out at the stillness of the city below, the dark skyline broken only by the occasional flicker of a passing car. The silence felt different now, not heavy, not suffocating, but clean. Purposeful. It wasn't that I didn't care. I cared too much for too long. I had cared to the point of breaking. And now, for the first time, I had chosen myself. And choosing myself meant letting them fall. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because they had never once considered that I could. There is a particular kind of grief that doesn't come in the form of crying or mourning or collapsing onto the floor in some cinematic display of devastation, but rather arrives in quiet moments, in the pause before a breath, in the hesitation of your hand before it clicks download on a folder filled with years of financial transactions that, when lined up and printed out, look less like the record of generosity and more like a cold, methodical spreadsheet of emotional currency spent with zero return. That was the moment I found myself in, not sad, not angry, not even triumphant, just numb, seated at my desk in the fading light of a Tuesday afternoon, staring down an Excel sheet that contained every transfer, every bill payment, every last cent I had funneled into the lives of people who had seen my success not as a product of my hard work or sacrifice, but as a convenient faucet that never needed tightening. When I finally printed it, the machine seemed to groan under the weight of it, the paper spilling onto the desk like some bureaucratic avalanche, each sheet marked with numbers, dates, merchant names, a tangible record of a decade's worth of helping out. A phrase that had lost all meaning the moment it became an obligation rather than an offering. I stapled the stack together, page after page of charges both massive and absurd. $5,000 for Sophie's healing retreat in Sedona, $1,500 for a new washing machine after my mother said hers was possessed, $800 a month for my father's emergency golf club dues during the pandemic, which he somehow justified as therapy and labeled it, with no irony, no bitterness, simply what you took. It wasn't even about the money anymore, not really. It was about the story that each line told, the way it laid bare just how transactional our relationships had become, how deeply ingrained the expectation was that I would simply pay and shut up. How rarely anyone had stopped to consider the toll that kind of quiet, endless giving might take on a person who, for all her success, had never once been allowed to say no without becoming the villain. I didn't know what I was going to do with the file, not yet, but I knew it had to exist. I needed a monument to the truth, something undeniable, something I could hold in my hands and say, here, this is what happened. This is what I gave you. And this is what it cost me. Later that night, after the voicemails had piled up and the texts had shifted from confusion to frustration to something bordering on desperation, I found myself dialing a number I hadn't used in years, Aunt Janine, my mother's older sister. The family ghost who had vanished from our lives somewhere around my 12th birthday, rumored to have run off with a yoga instructor and a bottle of gin, though the more likely truth was far simpler. She had chosen herself, and in doing so, had been banished from the Meyer family mythos as a selfish, unstable woman who never quite understood what family meant. She picked up on the second ring, her voice dry and amused, like she had been expecting me to call for years, but was too proud to say so. Well, she said, without even a hello, look who finally joined the dark side. I didn't need to explain much. She already knew the rhythm of it, the choreography of guilt and obligation that came with being a woman in this family. The way your worth was measured not in how much you were loved, but in how much you gave, and how quietly you gave it. I spent 20 years trying to buy my way into their approval, she said, lighting a cigarette with the kind of unapologetic defiance I could hear even through the phone. Paid for their cars, their trips, hell, even the down payment on that god-awful lake house. You know what I got when I said I couldn't do it anymore? A letter from your mother saying I was emotionally unreliable. She exhaled sharply, a bitter laugh hiding behind her words. Don't let them rewrite the story, Rachel. Not this time. I told her about the receipts. The cutoff. The silence. She didn't say, good job, or I'm proud of you. She said something better. Peace is expensive, she muttered, and it never goes on sale. I hung up a few minutes later, not lighter exactly, but more anchored, more certain that I wasn't the crazy one, that this wasn't an overreaction, that maybe the only thing I was guilty of was finally refusing to subsidize a lie. I knew what came next. They would return home early, humiliated, cornered by the realization that the rules had changed. And when they did, I wanted them to see it, all of it, laid out in black and white, undeniable, unspinnable. The next day, I bought a folder. Not a fancy one. Just something sturdy. I placed the pages inside, each one a receipt of absence, of emotional vacancy disguised as gratitude, and slid it into the drawer by my front door. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel strong. I just felt real, like for the first time, I wasn't pretending to be okay with things that had never been okay. Like I had stopped performing the role of the good daughter, the reliable one, the emotional ATM with a smile. Like I had finally decided that maybe, just maybe, I was allowed to matter too. And somewhere in the middle of that quiet, in the space between guilt and resolve, a text from Sophie lit up my screen, sharp, childish, and so very predictable. You're being cruel. You've always been jealous of me. Just admit it. I stared at it for a moment, not surprised, not even irritated, just exhausted by the simplicity of it, by the way she had reduced decades of imbalance, exclusion, and conditional love into a playground insult. So I replied, not with anger, not with explanation, just with a single line that felt heavier than any argument could ever be. Check your bank account. I knew what she'd find. I had closed her last open balance that morning, a savings account I'd set up in her name when she was 24, back when I still believed she'd grow out of the entitlement and maybe, one day, recognize what I'd done for her. 10 years of automatic deposits, untouched by her hands, now gone, transferred back to mine, the final transaction in a ledger that would never be balanced. I didn't wait for her response. I didn't need one. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't seeking a reaction. I wasn't looking for validation or understanding or even acknowledgement. I was just cleaning house. And the silence that followed? It didn't feel empty. It felt earned. The truth is, there's a kind of power in silence that most people never really learn to wield, not because they can't, but because silence is often mistaken for surrender, for weakness, for some kind of passive retreat, when in fact, in the right hands, it's the sharpest weapon a person can hold. It doesn't scream. It doesn't justify. It doesn't offer the other party a foothold to argue or explain or rewrite the narrative. Silence just sits there, cold, unwavering, merciless, daring you to fill it with your own guilt. And when the knock came at my door, 3 days after they had returned from Maui earlier than planned, tanned and tired and absolutely unraveling beneath the thin fabric of civility they wore like a veil, I didn't feel rage or fear or even satisfaction. What I felt, standing in my living room, hearing the knock echo through my quiet apartment, was the still, unshakable confirmation that I no longer owed them anything, not my money, not my explanations, not even my voice. They didn't ring the bell twice. Just once, followed by that long, waiting silence that always says more than words ever could. I let it sit. I wanted them to sweat. I wanted them to feel, maybe for the first time in their lives, what it was like to be on the other side of dismissal, to stand in someone else's silence and not be sure whether they were going to be welcomed in or shut out entirely. When I finally opened the door, the sight of them was almost underwhelming. My father, shoulders slightly slumped, his suitcase still by his side like he wasn't sure if he was staying or leaving. My mother, lips pressed together in that brittle expression she used whenever she was trying not to cry or scream or both. And Sophie, arms crossed, face tight, clearly furious, but too unsure of the power dynamic now to lead the charge. I didn't speak. I stepped aside. They entered slowly, cautiously, like they were walking into a trap instead of their eldest daughter's home, their eyes scanning the space like they were trying to decode my mood from furniture placement. I closed the door behind them, moved past them without a word, and took my place on the arm of the couch, back straight, fingers locked together, every inch of me calm in a way that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with control. For a long, excruciating moment, no one said a word. My mother shifted. My father cleared his throat. Sophie huffed under her breath. And then, finally, my father spoke. We just want to understand. I almost laughed, but didn't. Because they didn't want to understand. They wanted to manage. To contain. To soothe the discomfort long enough to go back to the status quo. They wanted the faucet back on. I leaned down and reached for the folder I'd placed there hours earlier, almost forgetting about it until that moment. The one labeled What You Took, which I slid across the coffee table with the kind of deliberate slowness that made my mother's breath hitch. None of them reached for it. You think this is about a vacation, I said, finally breaking the silence, my voice low and steady, not angry but final. But it's not. That trip was just the last page in a book you've all been writing for years, and I finally stopped editing it for you. My mother opened the folder, hands trembling ever so slightly, and her eyes scanned the first page, not a letter, not a manifesto, but cold, hard math. Numbers. Dates. Transfers. Every charge. Every unacknowledged deposit. Every ignored plea for boundaries that I had disguised as no worries and happy to help over the years. There was no commentary, no dramatic underlining, no clever summary. Just data. The kind of data that's impossible to argue with. This is, she started, but trailed off, as if she couldn't find the word that would excuse it. It's the record, I said simply. Of what I gave. Of what you took. Of what you expected. Sophie scoffed, that harsh, defensive little sound she always made when she felt cornered, but didn't want to admit it. So what, this is you punishing us? No, I replied, turning to her now. This is me finally choosing to stop being punished by you. She rolled her eyes, but her voice shook when she spoke again. You didn't have to go nuclear, Rachel. You could have said something. I tilted my head. I did. For years. You just weren't listening. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. No one screamed. No one stormed out. The drama wasn't in the volume. It was in the recognition. In the slow, dawning realization that this wasn't a phase, or a tantrum, or some elaborate emotional manipulation. This was the end of something and the beginning of something else they couldn't yet see. And for people who had always been so good at controlling the narrative, that terrified them more than anything. My father looked down, and for the first time in my life, I saw it. Not pride, not shame exactly, but something in between, some fragile understanding that he had lost me, not through one single act, but through a lifetime of small, corrosive decisions. My mother looked at me like she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Sophie, meanwhile, stood still, eyes glassy, trying to summon some version of her that could make sense of all this, the version that was always adored, always rescued, always at the center. They left without taking the folder. My mother placed it gently back on the table like it might burn her if she held it too long. I didn't ask them to stay. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't move to hug anyone. I just stood there as they walked out, the door closing behind them with a click that echoed louder than anything they'd said. And then it was just me again. The quiet returned, not heavy or accusing this time, but clean, almost peaceful. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just stood there and breathed. They would go back to their lives, at least what was left of them, and maybe they'd try to spin it, twist it into a tale of a daughter who turned cold, who forgot what family meant, who let money poison her heart. Or maybe, in the quiet of their own moments, they'd finally hear what my silence had been saying all along. Because sometimes, the most brutal thing you can do to someone who refuses to see you is simply to stop showing up. Not in anger. Not in hate. But in total, unwavering clarity. They thought they could go to paradise without me, thought I'd keep paying the bills with a smile, thought my place in their life was permanent and unconditional and invincible. They were wrong. And when the silence came after them, it didn't sound like revenge. It sounded like freedom.